All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you all joining us today for what I know will be a really incredible conversation. We have such an amazing, interesting, diverse group of perspectives here for this roundtable discussion. And I'm going to start off. I'm Cassandra Koblenz, Senior Curator and Director of Public Engagement at the Orange County Museum of Art. And I'm going to start out just by introducing them, and then I'm going to hand over the program to Daniel Duford, who I will introduce and who will moderate the conversation. So our first discussant that I'll introduce to you today is Carolyn Finney. Carolyn is a storyteller, author, and a cultural geographer. She is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. Carolyn is grounded in both artistic and intellectual ways of knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but 5 years of backpacking trips through Africa, Asia, and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Motivated by these experiences, Carolyn returned to school after a 15-year absence to complete a BA, MA, in gender and environmental issues in Kenya and Nepal, and a PhD along with public speaking, writing, media engagement, consulting, and teaching at Wellesley, UC Berkeley, and the University of Kentucky. She served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years, which assists the National Park Services in building relationships of reciprocity with diverse communities. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. A new book of creative nonfiction that explores identity, race, lived experience, and the construction of a Black environmental imaginary, and a performance piece about John Muir, which I'm very curious about, is in the process, in the works. Carolyn is presently doing a 2-year residency in the Franklin Environmental Center at Middlebury College. Our next discussant is Los Angeles-based artist Edgar Arsenault. He received a BFA from Art Center College of Design and an MFA from California Institute of the Arts. He constructs drawings, installations, video, and film works as complex arrangements of association that examine adjacencies and points of contact between implausible relations. Constantly working in new modes, Arsenault directed his first play, Until, at the Performa Biennial in New York City in November 2015, and was awarded the Malcolm McLaren Best of Show Award. He has participated in the Rauschenberg Residency in Captiva Island, Florida, Art Pace in San Antonio, Skowhegan, Banff Center in Canada, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this one in Germany. Solo exhibitions have been... Thank you. Solo exhibitions have been presented at the Vera List Center at MIT in Cambridge, Mass., the Hammer Museum, Los Angeles Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Museum für Gegenwartskunst in Basel, Switzerland. I'm not good with the German, obviously. And a collaborative drawing show with Wengechi Mutu at Sites in Spain. Our next discussion is Corey Newkirk. Corey has shown his artwork in solo and group exhibitions around the world. In addition to monographic surveys at the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Pasadena Museum of California Art, Newkirk has had solo exhibitions at Roberts Project Los Angeles, LAX Art Los Angeles, the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, among many others. His work has also been featured in numerous group exhibitions, including Blues for Smoke at MoCA LA, the 2006 Whitney Biennial, the Whitney Museum of Art in New York, Dakar, the 7th Dakar Biennial in Dakar, Senegal, Uncertain States of America, the Astrup Fearnley Museum of Modern Art in Oslo, Norway, the 2004 California Biennial at the Orange County Museum of Art, and Freestyle at the Studio Museum of Harlem. Newkirk received his MFA from the University of California, Irvine in 1997, and his BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1993. He currently lives and works in Los Angeles. And we have Daniel Duford, who will be our moderator, as I mentioned. Daniel is an artist, curator, writer, and teacher based in Portland, Oregon. He tells stories drawn from North American history and mythology. He is a 2019 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, a 2010 Hallie Ford Fellow, and a recipient of a 2012 Art Matters grant. His work has been shown nationally, including the Orange County Museum of Art, Mass MoCA, the Atlanta Center for Contemporary Art, the Bellevue Arts Museum, and the Boise Art Museum. Residencies include the MacDowell McDowell, Crow's Shadow Art Center, and Ash Street Projects. He has taught at Reed College and Pacific Northwest College of Art. He currently teaches at Portland Community College, Rock Creek campus. His solo exhibition, John Brown's Vision on the Scaffold, at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at PSU, opened in March and was shut down a week later, but will likely open later this fall. A second version of the show is scheduled to open in October 2020 at the Schneider Museum of Art in Ashland, Oregon. So you can see we have an incredibly esteemed group of people with us today to talk about this complicated and rich topic. So I'm going to hand it over to Daniel, who's going to start. I think, well, the other thing I didn't mention is Daniel curated for ACMA an exhibition that we also had on view at the museum, an Earth Song, a Body Song, figures with landscape from the ACMA permanent collection. And Daniel curated that show as part of our third season at ACMA Expand that was looking at issues around environmentalism and our relationship to nature. And so this project, this collaboration of him curating the show came out of his work with us on that. And I'll let him take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra, and thank you to all of you who are here. It's a real honor to be on this panel. I guess I'll just really quickly talk about the origin of the show. So when we were looking at the permanent collection to think about works that speak to environmentalism or landscape, I wanted to look at the works that weren't typically what we think of, which is a view of a landscape or a particular environmental viewpoint. Partly because my thinking has evolved where I don't actually like the word environment or environmentalism or nature, because they are, as we'll unpack a little bit as we speak today, I think those are ideas that we have in our culture, which are connected to a whole bunch of other kind of capitalist ideas, colonial ideas. And they usually, just within the way that you think about them, they leave out a certain way of experiencing the landscape. There's only one way to do it. So one of the first pieces that came up that really inspired the show was a Jacob Lawrence piece. And it's from a series he did called The Black Belt, which I think was for Life magazine, Fortune magazine, sorry. And so what I was looking for, and what happened was I started to find works, and then they began to tell a story as I put them together. And I realized what the works were about the instead of looking at the landscape as this kind of neutral thing that's here and we stand back and look at it, in order for us to think about, instead of the environment, the living world, you think about all the fact that people actually have to be engaged in that living world and work in that space, and that there are power structures that have made it so that certain that is only used in certain ways, or certain people can't use that, or left out of the narrative. So this is one of the first works that's up. There's the Jacob Lawrence, and this is from the Black Belt series. And I think what's interesting about this show, now that we're in the middle of a pandemic and we've had all of the protests and uprising in the past month, I think there's a certain resonance that comes out of this. And so in this case, this is a depiction of African Americans who, at this point in history, have been cut from a promise of land after emancipation. And this is a second kind of bondage that's happening. And Jacob Lawrence is depicting this, telling the story. And in this case, it's also the people who are working the landscape. Normally in typical landscape art, the people who work it are just part of nature. So I thought this is a really powerful piece to start with. And then if you want to go to the next slide. So I just pulled a few pieces from the show to think about. So this is Kim Abel's Winter Clear Days, 1 Month of Smog from 1990. So this is actual smog that is from LA, or I think it's in LA. It's at Planet Earth. And you can see how dirty that is. And so when I was looking at, when Cassandra and I were talking about this panel, the way I was looking at this is like, I can't breathe. So that, what does that mean? I can't, through COVID, through, the words of George Floyd, through this idea that this pervasive damage is being done, but it spreads everywhere, and but not evenly. And so I thought this, in the new context, was really interesting to think about this. Plus the fact that when it shut down, LA the air got very clean very quickly. So you want to go to the next one? So this is Carlos Almaraz, who is a Mexican-American painter. And this one I thought was really, I chose this one because this kind of deals with the idea that it has a kind of Albert Pinkham writer, sublime landscape. There's a kind of mythic quality to it. But again, in the typical narrative, particularly of American landscape, Mexican Americans were seen as a thing in the landscape, not personhood who's engaged in the making of the landscape. And so this is just a really beautiful, it's a very small painting, a real jewel of a painting. So go to the next one. And then this is Daniel Martinez's plans for an actual house, which is the house America built. And it's a critique of this idea of the rugged individual. It's conflating Thoreau's cabin and the Unabombers. And it's this narrative we have about the way one engages with nature. It's usually like a solitary white man who goes out, and that's the one person who gets to have the epiphany. But in here, there's this kind of weaponizing of wilderness solitude and racializing that idea. And so I thought this is a really powerful work to again think about who gets to use the space and who doesn't. And I think there's just a few of these. These are the plans that you would actually build the cabin or build the structure. And then the next one, I just wanted to, this doesn't represent all the works in the show, but this just gives you a sense to frame what we're going to talk about today. Then the next slide, I think, is Alan Sekula, the photographer. And so this is not what you'd normally think of in terms of landscape or environment, but it absolutely is. These are dock workers loading sugar in Calais. And so what I thought about with this one was this, not only is sugar this connected to this long colonial history and a global market that has affected all of the ways in which in which the global environment is, or global ecology is affected, but it's also just the site of Calais is also in Europe. It's a point where migrants are trying to get through Europe over to the UK, and it's a very contentious spot, of migration, of global migration. And so then the next two, we're going to now move into Corey's and Edgar's work. But I just wanted to say, in the putting together of this work, as the story began to become told from the work, one of the pieces, or actually both Corey and Edgar's were two pieces, like, these two pieces have to be in here because they're really important ways of telling the story and connecting all the other works in the show, because they are talking about space and place, but not from the perspective that which we normally see it, which tends to be quote unquote neutral, but really is a viewpoint of that reflects a particular system of power. So I think the next one is Corey, which is Hutch, which is in the show. And I don't know, Corey, do you want to talk about that?
I mean, I can. First, let me just say thank everyone for coming and letting me participate in this. I'm super honored to be here. Well, what would you like me to say? I mean, I can talk just generally about this piece. Again, it is a landscape. It is. I can tell you. I'm not going to tell tons of things or
Right.
talk too much about it. I will just give the things that I think are potentially interesting. Before I talk about the larger role of me and
Right.
this in landscape. You know, this piece is kind of named after, it's an abbreviation from a town that I have not come from, but have spent some time in, a small town or medium-sized town in Kansas. It is based on playground. There was a figure in this landscape originally, which has been removed. You know, I don't know what else I want to say about it right at the moment, but it
Yeah.
is certainly can be seen as a contested site in the larger way in that I work and that I approach my approach to the depictions of landscape that I choose. You know, it's really kind of about who gets to sort of have this vista, who gets to stand at this place and look
Mhm.
on this. You know, it gets shared with the audience, but to me, they are really questions about my own subjectivity and my body in the world.
Mhm. Great. Um, do you want to just go quickly through the other images and then we'll look at Edgar's as well, or no?
I mean,
Okay.
I don't know. I'm open to it. Sure, we could do that.
I think the other images were in response to the questions we were going to ask later too.
Okay. Okay. So I guess we can, well, when we get to the questions, and we'll look at Edgar's piece, which is in the show, which is from a series, and the piece is Blind Pig, and it's a particular reference to a history. And so I don't know if you want to just say a quick thing about it, Edgar, and then before we get into the larger questions, because I'll ask you more specifically about telling the story of this, but do you want to just have one quick introduction for this piece?
Sure. So a Blind Pig is is an underground drinking establishment in Detroit. They're essentially the speakeasies that were born out of these out of the segregationist practices in Detroit, where blacks weren't allowed to drink in the local bars, so they would commonly exist in basements or in people's homes. Um, and it was in a Blind Pig party, and a party in a Blind Pig in a basement, um, where the police had raided. It was a party for a bunch of guys who had just come back from Vietnam, and there was an undercover cop in there. Discovered that there was alcohol and drugs, and called in the police. And I think they started arresting people somewhere in the late evening, and it was about 6 o'clock in the morning when they had finished taking everyone away. And just dozens and dozens of people. And according to the story, you know, when the last cop car was leaving, a bottle flew through the air and broke out the back of the police cruiser, and then that was the spark that set off the uprising in Detroit in 1965.
Wow, great. But yeah, it's really it's really lovely to see actually the pieces in conversation with each other in the space, and so I think that's a really also important part of the exhibition. So actually this is a good place to start with the first kind of discussion point, which is narrative and story. So what works through many of the works in the exhibition. I don't know if I also mentioned that the title of the show comes from the Langston Hughes poem Earth Song. So that's actually the origin of that title, Earth Song, a body song. So narrative and story is really central to how land and public space is used and perceived. So there are ways in which Black and Brown people have been left out of those environmental movements, which Carolyn speaks very eloquently about in her book. And public land use in public parks are connected to that particular narrative. and we could pinpoint all the laws and the histories that led to this this kind of cultural construction. And again, you think about outdoor space. If you're Black and you're having a barbecue in a park, having someone call the police on you versus there's all these different ways in which that narrative who is often shown hiking through the woods. So this is for Carolyn. In your description of yourself, you actually call yourself a storyteller first. And I really love that. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that role of story and how you connect it to geography, which is also another part of your discipline.
Yeah, excuse me. Sorry, I was just really enjoying listening to Edgar and Corey about their work. I took so many notes because, part of the reason that I say storyteller, part of it is my own personal, try to find a way to talk about who I am and who we are collectively, but it's also pointing to the stories we don't tell. And for me, that's a lot of what you've been saying. I want to, the two things that people, when they hear me talk about this issue, that I always want to start off with, one, what's always going to be true in this country, no matter how far down the road we get, is that all this land was stolen. And it was stolen from the original indigenous native people. And in many cases, they were killed. So I'm just going to say that bluntly. Two, we enslaved another group of people to work that land for free, right? So we carry that. And for me, whenever we talk about landscape, think about landscape, engage the idea of landscape, part of how we have told that story, we don't always start with that, but that's for me the beginning of that story in this country. And it infuses everything. It infuses every story. One of the things that I also like to say is that I feel like we've been bamboozled about the environmental narrative in this country. It's not to say that what we've been saying isn't true, but it isn't the only truth. And for me, it points to what you were saying about subjectivity. Who gets to say the story? For me, that story also reveals the power, the privilege, where a person is situated, what we value, who we say the we is, who is the public. It gets so complicated in terms of what it exposes, but oftentimes we tell these stories as though this is the truth for everybody. So the story is the European immigrants came over, there was manifest destiny, they settled, they helped to build this country. That story isn't untrue, but that is just one piece of the truth, right? Which is part of what you were saying. As an example, when you showed the first painting by Jacob Lawrence in the heart of the Black Belt, what it made me think of was, in 1937, Pere Lorentz supposedly directed the first film that was considered the first environmental film. And the environmental conservation community loved it. And it was an old little grainy black and white film that was about the impact of the Mississippi floods on the landscape, right? So the Mississippi, the Black Belt, you had both white and Black farm families there at that time. If you watch that film, there isn't a single Black person in the film. So you just made a film about the landscape where that's called the Black Belt, but you don't have a Black farmer in the film, right? And the conservation movement loved it. They thought, oh my gosh, they're talking about technology, what we need to do to start thinking about and protecting the land. And yet there isn't a single Black person there. So the question of erasure, again, who gets to choose to be selectively visible? And I say this to people all the time, bias isn't the same thing as racism, man, but they live in close proximity to each other, right? We're all biased, we all, I would argue, have blinders on. We don't know what we don't know. But also privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what was going on in Pere Lorentz's head, but you don't think that was a choice, and that he was privileged to also make that choice to tell this story in a very limited way, because you're going to start talking about Jim Crow segregation. That complicates the whole conservation environmental landscape conversation if we have to actually delve into that. And also it implicates everybody, right? So we start thinking about how we're all implicated, and we're not all implicated in the same way, how we are all implicit. One of the other pieces that you put up there, I also want to point to in terms of story, that it made me think of, and I can't remember, I think it might have been Daniel Martinez's piece about, and I heard you say, who we see on the landscape and who we don't. That made me think of Thoreau, but actually I was thinking about the artist Ramiro Gomez. And Ramiro Gomez came to my attention. He's a young Latinx artist that you all probably know in LA, is because what he did, he wanted to make visible the Latinx presence on expensive, wealthy landscapes in Beverly Hills in LA, because they're the ones actually caring for that landscape. And for me, this is personal because that's the job my parents did for 50 years in New York. They cared for a wealthy family's landscape, but became invisible in the story. And so he paints full-size images of Latinx gardeners and others, and he places them on that landscape, right? And then takes a photograph of them so that we don't forget who's, in terms of labor, who's often not only loving those landscapes, but caring for them so that the rest of us can show up and enjoy them as we will. So for me, it's like, how do we tell those stories? How do we tell those stories? What are those stories we're telling? Who gets to tell those stories, right? Whose voice do we hear that can, I kind of share the story from their own perspective and with their own sense of knowing about what that story is. And what does it mean when we don't tell those stories? I could go on. I'm gonna stop because I'll take up all the space.
Well, Edgar, it looked like you wanted to say something about, like, get back to that point of the land was taken and genocide. Did you want to?
Well, yeah. I mean, I didn't have any papers, so I just jotted it down in the chat just so we can share it with each other, so I didn't lose the thought. But I could say in particular within the drawings that I was making, but I would say in general with our at least the poetics that we tend to attach to the landscape when we think about nature as something which is awe-inspiring, which is something connected to something epic, when it has a certain kind of sublime sentiment. Oftentimes that does have to do with horror or fear being obscured just enough or giving us just enough distance where we start to find it to be beautiful, right? Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why I went to Detroit for the first time with the art historian Julian Myers was because I had read an article in the New York Times that the Super Bowl was going to be there and they were transforming the whole downtown. So we jumped on airplanes and got there as quickly as we could to make sure that we were able to like capture this before this erasure started to happen. And it was a bit of PR. I mean, they really only had redone the faces of the buildings, within a few blocks of the Super Bowl. But I did realize that, there's a certain kind of beauty that we attribute to the ruin, when things have started to decay to a point to where, we can look at what it was. It becomes like a relic of a certain moment in time, and that spatial distance has a certain sublime expression, right? And we often, we write poetry about it. We make music about, about giant landscapes and beautiful oceans and things like that can kill us. That's actually filled with a great degree of dread, from a certain distance, it becomes beautiful again. And I just wanted to introduce that idea into this conversation about the landscape, because as artists, we have to think about, at least I try to think about the kind of inherent contradictions of representation, right? Like when you represent something, you can recognize that it's both beautiful, but at the same time, that the beauty by its very nature, I guess is what I'm getting at, is part obscurity. Like, you know what I mean? Like, does that make sense? What I'm saying, Carolyn?
Yeah.
Or to any of you?
And Edgar, what it's making me think, and maybe I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but what it was making me think about, that sublime, how landscapes, we can see these beautiful landscapes and we think that they're beautiful, that depending on who you are, that's another way within which that beauty or that fear is shaped, right? So if we think about Christian Cooper going into the park to birdwatch, right, and then having his skin color weaponized, right, or George Floyd at the other end of the continuum, in a landscape and losing his life, right, and being killed. I think that's something that I'm not speaking for anyone but myself, but I imagine so many of us have felt about certain spaces. I mean, I tell people all the time, I spent a lot of time backpacking by myself in other parts of the world. And there are places in this country I would never go backpacking by myself. I just wouldn't. I mean, I'm just being real, you know.
Yeah, I know.
And I
It's,
still, it actually makes me sad, but I know my history a little bit, you know. So
yeah, yeah.
And I think that idea of the sublime, where it comes from, is this idea that you're standing back. Like in those, all those things, it's the person who's standing back, and you're standing looking at this view, and so that also kind of speaks to a kind of ownership. Like I get to see this. I get to look at my lands, which is different than if you think about like the experience of the world or the of geography, which is like I'm in it and I'm surrounded by the thing. So the sublime also,
Yeah.
which I have to say, I do love to look at some of those great old, like 19th century paintings, but there is something in them that is about the remove of the viewer, of the artist, and almost all of them in their ruins, like in the 19th century, is always like some and there's a sense like, well, the indigenous people are gone and it's inevitable. Isn't that sad? But look, everything else is great. We're moving forward. So I think it's about that. Like there's it's not really embodying the land. You're not embodied inside the landscape, or you're sort of stepping back from it. And that's a tradition that we have in the that has actually defined landscape, I think. And it's a privilege. It is a privileged position, for sure.
Can be, yeah, it can be.
But actually, Cor, I wanted to ask you about because you had mentioned a little bit in your piece that idea of like who gets to be in that landscape. Like in Hutch, there's the public park. Would you talk like, and also some of the other images you showed? Would you talk a little bit about that idea of like the embodiment of being in the space? Because you kind of mentioned that a little bit.
I could try. I think that overall in the work, I don't know if you want to show it while I talk. It's just where we show it while I talk about it, or I mean, I just think I usually try to strive in my work to confront some of these narratives about who owns that, who gets to stand there, who gets to see this, whose property is this, and just what it sort of means to have a body that looks like mine be in these spaces, right? Like, what does it mean to, for example, if we look at this image, Par, what does it mean to like be on that type of green stuff, right? A lawn, right? Who do we associate with green, pristine lawns? It's, my understanding and the narratives and the dominant history that I sort of grew up around is usually not necessarily someone who looks like me, even though I can fully embody this and have experience with laying on a lawn, owning property, being in these situations. But, I have really spent a lot of time just trying to sort of in my own way push back against some of these things, that this constant onslaught of, oh, you certainly should not be in this neighborhood, on this lawn, or in that grass, or looking at this. But the reality is that my upbringing is actually rather rural at parts. A large majority of it is spent way in the sort of middle of New York State, up in the country. So, that is my narrative that is directly, I think, at times in opposition to the dominant narrative of this is an urban situation, only urban. Right?
What city were you growing up in? What city was that?
This is Cortland, New York. It's near Ithaca and Syracuse. It's like the geographic center of the state, right? So,
okay.
But then there's lots of time spent in New York City. So living with both of those, the reality of a very urban upbringing and a very rural upbringing, and trying to sort of, how do I navigate and speak about the space in between both of those that is my reality? And for some reason, somehow I picked up on the land and the landscape and space. Here I am, again, in that sort of perhaps more suburban situation, but trying to talk again about ownership and place and subjectivity and me.
And Corey, I love these images, and they're bringing up a lot for me too, because I grew up in Westchester County on land, and we were the only Black family in this
Oh yes.
predominantly white, not predominantly white, all white, very rich. And we were only living there because my parents cared for the land. So we lived in a gardener's cottage on this property, and my parents cared for 50 years. So these images of me and my brothers, that's why I'm looking at these images and going, yeah, I can just see my brother. Like we play outside here. And I've told stories when I was 9, coming home from school, getting stopped by the cops asking me where I was going and wondering if I worked there. And I'm 9 years old. You also made me think about, Corey, right? A recent story in the news about a week or two ago, it was in Florida, a young Black teenager. Her name is Brianna Nelson Hicks. She was 15, and she lived with her grandfather in Wellington, I guess is a wealthy white neighborhood. And she was walking with 2 white girls, or I guess her friends, and this older white man, it got caught on video, right? Him saying, "You don't belong here." Because the other issue for me, I mean, we can talk about ownership, and even for me, that's complicated about really who owns this land, because now, whenever I say ownership, I have to think about the original people here and how complicated that is. But also, for me, it's the right to be able to say you belong, right? So there's a significant question of belonging, and people being able to say to you, you don't belong here, like him saying that to her. And that's, for me, that's a scar now she has, regardless of what happens after that you're continually being reminded you don't belong here. And we're continually having to tell the stories, do the images, say, yes, we do. And here's how we belong here. So if we're in that park in Oakland and that white woman is saying to that Black family who didn't, I don't know, light their outdoor stove correctly, if you remember that story like 2 years ago, those stories, and it is not about us it's not about us showing up how someone else thinks we should show up. That's the point here, right? It's like we also get to define what that relationship is. There's not some universal understanding, even though I feel like we've all been educated to believe that there is.
So true. So true. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have, as you're talking about that, I'm trying to think of instances where I have been perhaps made to feel or directly told that I don't belong out in the world. Nothing is coming, sadly and yet happily, nothing is coming to mind, right? Where I have been actually pushed, inside or outside or removed from this situation for my enjoyment of the environment. So, but I do know that it is always, I think, similar to something that you said about backpacking all over the world. There are places and times when I have certainly felt uncomfortable, right? Or, it just by being in, the world.
Well, and I think that for a lot of us in the bodies we live in, our bodies challenges people, because I've been, I have been challenged, but more than that, I've had those, what I call them the little incivilities, the right of, and I'm just going to say this, and I say this gently, but the right of, I can't tell you how many white people in different parts of this country feel like they can stop me on the street, stop me in a place that I am, come up to me and ask me everything from, tell us about your hair, can we touch it, how do you take care of it, where are you from, you must be mixed. I mean, throughout my life, challenging my presence there, trying to find a way to place it in their lexicon of who they expect to see and what they don't expect to see, and I don't know in this space at this given time. And so there's this feeling that I know that I have, that others have of constantly having to explain, explain why I'm here, what I'm doing, what it means. And what does that represent? And so we live in a country where we promote individualism. And this is something that those of us who know what the Black tax is know. If you are Black, you have to represent the whole race. There's no space for you to be an individual, and your individualism being challenged, because not only are you in that space, but you're showing up in that space the way you want to show up in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't look familiar, if it challenges somebody else's idea of what that means, then it becomes a problem.
Well, of course. I mean, and naturally, I am like a 6'2" Black guy. So, you know, if I am in these spaces, I always wonder what is going to be scarier. Is it the environment around me? Is it that sublime nature, or is it just me? Right? Like, what is going to sort of make someone think about that environment and the bodies in it in a way that they might not have? And really, I kind of know the answer as to which one perhaps might be more threatening. But I forgot to put the work in where I deal with the other parts of the environment working against me, as compared to really trying to play nice with it and to reclaim it and to claim my place in it. I do have a body of work where that is not so. The relationship is different, where I am fighting against, like this, against the cold, right? The snow, and this body of work also has another component that is great white sharks. So it's basically the two white things that can kill me, the great white sharks, playing up to other sort of swimming stereotypes, and then the notion of, again, this body in certain parts of the world. And there I am, naked, standing on a 7-foot tall snow mound, again, trying to place my body into the environment, knowing full well what that means, and that, just trying to bring some questions up about who, what, where, when, and how in relation to this.
There's this idea. I'm going to come to Edgar, and I think we're kind of want to maybe take questions soon. But how are we doing on time? You doing okay? You doing okay?
Yeah, I think we have time to get into the conversation still.
Okay, good. So there's this idea of the invisible landscape, which is basically like, when you walk into a space, if you walk into any landscape, there's what you see. There's a physical thing in front of you. But then there's the invisible landscape, is like, what is the it's the way we all think of, like, if you're in your old neighborhood, you say, oh, that's where natures used to be, that's where which is now this and that. It's the memory that is laid over the top of the space. And so it's another way of engaging that speaks to the fact that the landscape is a lived in space. And so I'm just curious about, I want to go back to Edgar to talk a little bit more about that way in which you're kind of reclaiming, I love the term you use, the erasure of that invisible landscape, which, if anyone has seen, if you go into a contemporary city, it's very easy for that erasure to happen very fast and very definite, where all of a sudden there was that invisible landscape of story and memory, which is now gone. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in this work.
Yeah, I was thinking of how to try to draw a connection between Corey's work with the beads and the hair and these drawings. And sort of one connection that I'm making is this relationship between the fragment and the whole, where those beadworks are, accumulations of these little tiny bits of color, but from a certain perspective, it produces a picture. And I've been interested in that for years and years and years, and the ways in which fragments and wholes express themselves in different systems. So in these drawings, it's thinking about institutions and their relationships to to stratums that exist in nature. So when when Carolyn is walking and doing one of her excursions, we commonly come across these rock formations that have these different colors and stripes, and it's interesting because they're so mundane and we see them every day, but I mean it expresses millions of years of life on this planet. But the way in which those stratums are formed is through a sorting mechanism that happens from rain and wind and water, where when water runs down a mountain and it starts to erode it, certain elements will become separated apart, and it builds up these layers over time. But from a certain distance, of millions of years, that seems to be it kind of expresses something that feels eternal, like something that never changes. But when you realize that it's actually a clock that's moving very slowly and that the change is actually happening right before your eyes, I find that very difficult to fathom. You know what I mean? To like really take that in, because it's so much bigger than us as individuals. So that as a force, I try to juxtapose that to the way in which institutions work within cities. So like when an institution is built, like a library or Department of Public Transportation or a museum or the police department, these institutions are meant to be there to be in service of us, right? And we think of them as being things which are bigger than us, and having spent years and years and years thinking about the TV show The Wire on HBO and hearing the writers talk about institutions as being gods of the city, they kind of consider it as a kind of a Greek tragedy, except for instead of there being gods in the sky, there actually are institutions that are apathetic to us. So I was trying to draw a connection between these things that are meant to be here in service of us, these things that are meant to ground us and connect us, but may actually be completely apathetic to our needs, right? So in the first drawing, it was the blind pigs, and then in these later ones, I started thinking about buildings that express this level of erosion that we find beautiful, but they're also sort of a kind of failure at the same time.
Can I, Edgar, can I throw something in there? And I don't know if it makes sense in listening to you and the framing. So a few things, like I had to write them down. The first thing was that I thought of that song, we paved paradise and put up a parking lot. So that I popped in.
Oh yeah, it's a Joni Mitchell song, right?
I was thinking about how as human beings, we generally tend to think in 100-year increments, in part because that's potentially a life. But you're talking about geologic time, so that's 10,000 year increments. So part of our challenge is our inability to think in longer terms, right? But the other issue for me is that in the West, Native people aside, the indigenous perspective aside, we framed nature as though it's something separate from us. And it's funny to me to think that just because it's in a city that suddenly, and we've paved over it, that nature has disappeared. Nature is still there, aside the fact that we're part of that as well. Whatever we put in it and whatever we do, nature is still there. It is still the foundation of everything. So there's also something about how we remove ourselves. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we do it because it makes it easier to do the things we do to non-human nature if we remove ourselves enough, and we put all those layers in there. I don't know if that makes sense.
But I think the institution of religion is the one that's meant to fill that gap, right? I mean, when we think about like there's a kind of like these three scales. So you have the human, you have nature, and then you have the supernatural, right? So this idea of something being bigger than us. And I think for many people, religious narratives are the things that have helped to replace our sense of being connected to something greater. And I would maybe even take a leap and say, that the places in which you might have contestation with other people when you're in these spaces of nature, they might be Christians who might be, who may have some idea of like black bodies in nature being part of the notion of the uncivilized, right? As opposed to a person who's there looking at birds. Just because of the history of the way in which the Bible was used to describe things which were natural and the things which were unnatural, that might be sort of part of that that connection. But
no, I would say that it's not all religious. I think some of it is spirit, and I don't think spirit and religion are the same. Because for me, the religion goes back to what you were saying about institution. One could make the case, let me say it gently, that religion is just an institutionalization of those ideas, but spirit is something else altogether.
Yeah, I didn't say spirit because I didn't think that spirituality was a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't think that spirituality was
Yeah.
a problem. I would just say that one last thing about these drawings is that the reason why the stratums are floating in the air is because I wanted to give them a sense of being in some indeterminate direction. Like we don't know where they're going, if these things are moving towards some place in which our conditions as a society, our relationships with each other within the U.S. would be better, or if things will continue to sort of move in this kind of polarization. But these drawings are made, in 2011, 2012, 2009, 2010, during the economic crisis when the housing bubble burst and everyone was being pushed outside of their homes and there was so much economic instability, which we're sort of a precipice in which we're standing on again today. Because of COVID.
Yeah, it does feel like this cycle is coming back around, and of like what we're seeing, what we thought we were out of, we're coming back to, and I think that's an important way of also thinking about not progress, but some other form of what if the dominant narrative is about progress going from one thing to another and rising. Which is embedded in those early landscapes. I think there's another way of thinking about it, which is in fact that there's this more of a circular way of moving through time, and I do think that is the place where artists and writers, as image makers, because writers are image makers as well, can begin to change this narrative. And I was, I just wanted to ask Corey one more thing about because we didn't really talk about the material. So there's the image, right? But there's also like the material in which the thing is manifested in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in your case, that's a version of the meaning, that's a part of the delivery system of the meaning is the material in which it's made. So I wonder if you could.
Sure, I could. You want me to talk about that? I mean, I will say that that is my attempt to imbue these materials with something, but with the understanding that I put it out there, I can't control it. But I would say that, particularly with those beaded curtains and the landscapes, that the materials in them are the things to me that point towards the urban. Mm-hmm. They point towards a sort of far more of an urban understanding, i.e. this or the sort of Black racialized body in that, without me having to be super didactic, right? Mm-hmm. Or point that out. But that the materials sort of, to me, function that way in direct opposition to the imagery, which is definitely more, or the majority of it is suburban, rural, and exurban. So again, trying to sort of go in between a lot of different things that I'm trying to talk about, right down the middle between the imagery and the materiality, like somewhere in between there, I think is the important place to be, or where I like to be, where I think that the what the works are really trying to talk to you about is somewhere in between there. And I guess then that then flips back into the viewer's own subjectivity and what they are willing or unwilling and able or unable to talk about and comprehend with what I've given.
Mm-hmm. They're really, with all of this work, there's also it's unfortunate that we have to do everything on Zoom, but the physicality of them it is really important to see the physicality of the material, to really look at it, to see how you experience it with your whole body. I feel like so you could see it somewhat on the screen, but as soon as everything opens, hopefully you can get down to Aqua.
Yeah.
I have a question for Carolyn. I'm curious. This is a little bit off the side of this, but it's similar, which is, so you've written this wonderful book that really just really lays out a lot of what we're talking about today. But now you're working on this John Muir piece, and I'm wondering, I'm just, if as much as you want to talk, I'm curious about what is it about using that as a channel, as opposed to this.
So a couple of things. In 1994, when I had kind of finished doing all this backpacking, decided to go back to school, and then before I knew it, I was getting 3 degrees. Right? The thing that motivated me when I was thinking about, my first love is the arts. I was an actor. That's where I stand. That's where my heart lives. And so when I was thinking about, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to go back to school because I'm interested in all these social issues out there. I want to improve my writing skills and ways to talk about that, but I don't want to give up the performance piece. And I saw Anna Deavere Smith, the Black actress, perform Twilight Los Angeles in 1994 on Broadway. And so for those of you who don't know, it's incredible. She basically, after the LA riots, she interviews something like 45 different people. And then she does a one-woman show where she plays them all. And so for me, one of the pieces that stuck out for me when I saw it, I said, that's what I want to do. And what I meant was, how do you tell stories of difference in place? And let them kind of live and breathe with each other and see what emerges when we do that. So jump ahead, and next thing I know, I always say I'm an accidental environmentalist. I started getting involved with the Park Service and people asking me to have these conversations and show up in very particular ways. In 2016, the Park Service had their 100-year anniversary of the national parks. And so suddenly at every gathering conference, there was well, what about John Muir? Let's talk about the fabulous John Muir. And I lived in California for 8 years. So if you say John Muir in California, you just got to be careful because, John Muir, he means something there. And I get it, right? And I was at a geography conference, and there were 8 of us on a panel, and we had all been asked the question, so how is John Muir relevant? Is John Muir still relevant in the 21st century? And we had 10 minutes to answer. And when I was preparing for this, I was like, oh, there's so many things I could say. And I started thinking about it in terms of a conversation. I served on the National Parks Advisory Board. I was the only African-American on that board at the time, with a really fabulous group of people, but I was the only Black person on that board. And I started thinking, was John Muir thinking about me? Someone looking like me would be part of that conversation. And then I started looking at that. There's that famous picture of John Muir and President Roosevelt from 1903. They're standing on an overhanging rock in Yosemite. And I'm imagining, okay, yeah, they must be having this amazing conversation, 2 very thoughtful, committed men. So I'm not taking anything away from that, though we can say there's all kinds, we can argue about their ideas of wilderness and all that stuff, but these were 2 very thoughtful, committed men. And when I started reading some of John Muir's own words, he was also racist. I'm not being dramatic, and I can be, but I'm not, in his own words, right? The way the man talked about Black people and brown people and Native people, he could, in one breath, say something really about sublime nature, right? Like Edgar was saying, he could talk about that sublimeness, and in the next breath, be saying something really negative about a Black person or a Native person. And actually, that's indicative of our country. I think actually that just exposes what I think is true and how we embrace that complexity. So I also started thinking about, it's not a short answer for me to answer this, but how I got here. So I started thinking about, what if he wrote a book, he took he wrote a book called A 1,000-Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867, where John Muir took a year to walk all the southern states, or a lot of them, to look at the impact of war on the landscape, right? And this is where one of the books where that racism and that commitment to non-human nature are both apparent, right? And I started thinking, well, what if a Black woman wrote that, right? And then I remembered, the movie Gone with the Wind, right? There was a Black author, her name will come back to me in a second, in the early 2000s who thought the same thing about Gone with the Wind. She said, well, what if that was from the perspective of a Black woman? So she wrote the book, The Wind Done Gone. It's great. That's right, it's great. And I started thinking, well, if I take a 1,000-mile walk through the Gulf and imagine a Black woman, and I changed it and called A 1,000-Mile Walk Was Rough in 1867. And then I passages from his book, from John Muir's book, and I mirrored it with passages that I created by a character called Sojourner Washington Douglas. Yeah, I had to work it all in there. But a lot of the passages, though I made them up, were based in fact, the lynchings that were happening at that time on the landscape, how she had to duck and weave on the landscape. And I wanted to have them both next to each other to say they're both not untrue, but it's a really different experience, commitment no less for either. But it's a really different experience for her to be Black. And then I kind of get to 1890 and I start saying Jim Crow is the man. 1990, Jim Crow's the man. 1910, Jim Crow is the man. I just keep going with because he's the man until she dies, right? And what that looks like. And then I started thinking about, if you ever read the book Rap on Race, and if you haven't, it's fabulous. It's a taped conversation between James Baldwin and Margaret Mead, the anthropologist. And they're talking about race. Fabulous. It's just a fabulous conversation. These two very different people, but very also thoughtful and engaged, right? And I started thinking, what if Muir and I had our own Rap on Race about the environment? And so that's where I got the idea. And then I did a little kind of funny conversation, which I shared in a few minutes with the audience. And then I wrote this up as a kind of a shorter article that just got published. Literally, I just got the thing in the mail. It's an organization called Signal Fire that does arts. And every year they publish an annual thing, and they made that the story. And I want to turn it, and I said, and I want it to be a one-woman show that actually has imagery, from my experience, my family's experience, the Black experience, superimposed with and on Muir's representations of nature. My interest is not in diminishing him, because I don't believe I need to diminish anyone in order to make space for myself and others like me, right, who look like me. But I want to have it in conversation, because the truth is, I believe it's always in conversation. But, some of us can privilege not to look at the other side of that conversation. And instead we take Muir's viewpoint as being the right one, the true one, and the only one. So I called it the N-word, which is why I call it the N-word, Nature Revisited. Yeah, I was trying to be fresh.
Carolyn, you're a crack up. I love you say I had to put all of it in there. I just put the rap, it's Rap on Race, not
Rap on Race.
Yeah, I just put the link in the chat field to all the attendees.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that you'll, and you want to plug your book real quick? Do you want to show everybody a cover of your book? Is that going to embarrass you to do that? I think it's so good.
Oh, thank you for saying that.
And then there it is. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Cassandra.
Somebody did it, because I'm like, I don't have it sitting here.
Okay. Well, you and I are different. I sure would have had my book up. It would have been on the wall. Would have had those paintings back there. There you go, Corey. Yeah. And maybe put a link to your book in the chat field too.
Yeah, and actually the website, if you go to, it's just my name, carolynfinney.com, but I can send that. That's where they can go.
Yeah, throw it in the chat. I'm sure people could just click on the link and then just go right to it and buy your book. Yeah. Just give me my cut. That's all.
Okay, hey.
10%. That's all I ask. 10%.
I did want to say, if anyone listening wants to ask any questions of our discussants, please type them into the Q&A field or the chat or whichever.
There's one already which said, would Carolyn say a little more?
I just wanted to make sure, Daniel, if there wasn't any last points that you wanted to bring up with the group before we shifted gears. But I know you had a lot of things you had hoped to discuss, and conversations go.
If I do one thing, I don't think there's one more quick thing, but I guess we've covered quite a bit. I think it would be good to maybe just, if anyone wanted to say any, like, one more thing about this idea, like, because right now public space is really hotly contested, and I don't know if this is going too far afield, but I'm like, so Carolyn, you wrote that wonderful piece about Christian Cooper in The Guardian. So that's like, that's a very great example of someone who's doing like the most genteel of activities, and that gets racialized, you know, so that, and Central Park. But then we have all this question of the removal of Confederate monuments in space, because those are actually defining public space. And now there's a number of WPA murals that are being contested. You know, here in Portland, there's been a lot of, there's been, you know, pretty steady protests for the last month. But at one point, there's a statue of a elk, which was in the downtown, kind of a iconic downtown Portland, and that was set on fire, that has also been politicized. And so I think there's a questioning now of what are the images, or what are the signs of public space, the markers of public space. I just don't know, anyone want to just like kind of do one more thing to talk about that, the kind of images that exist in public space that are meant theoretically for all of us, but they're marked for certain people. So
can I say something
Yeah.
to that?
Yeah.
Just sort of maybe a shorter way of dealing with it. I mean, I think, you know, within mass media, that this is a conversation which has come to the fore, and that it's being shared, and that a broader audience can engage with it. I mean, because there's a lot of revisionist history, particularly around Confederate monuments that were created as a kind of a neo revision of the Confederacy, and all that stuff should come down, because it was a bunch of bullshit even when it was built in the first place. But I think that the opportunity exists for us to re-encode spaces that we've forgotten about, or things that have been covered up and can be excavated. That first blind pig drawing I did was because I went and visited the site where the Detroit riots began, and the only thing that was there was a plaza and a sculpture, and there was no marker anywhere that was this site that had set off, you know, one of the great uprisings in the U.S. in the 1960s. It just wasn't marked at all. The only thing they did, which most cities do, is that they'll name the street after some Black hero, and this was Rosa Parks Boulevard now. So I think that the opportunity for us as a nation is to figure out, you know, what are those places that have either been covered up, or the things that have been effaced or erased, and then let's bring those things to the foreground. You know, tearing down stuff is important, but I think we have to put things in its place that are as powerful, most emotionally, spiritually, you know, create new spaces that are sacred. I think that's the real job in front of us right now.
And I want to add to that, you know, I'm all for tearing a lot of those structures down. I'm just going to say it, because not just because of what they stand for, but because they're supposed to represent everybody, and that is the lie. That is the lie that has to be uncovered. But I'm not for forgetting that we did that lie, because that tells us something about who we are, so we don't do it again. And sometimes it gets more complicated. You know, the whole story about Aunt Jemima, and on Aunt Jemima's pancakes and syrup and the image coming off. I don't know if any of you've read about the Black family that's really upset, because that representation of Aunt Jemima was actually one of their relatives who went around the country making pancakes. And so for them, they're making the case that, yeah, but now we're getting erased all over again. And actually that complicates it, because they're Black. So, you know, to really understand for me is, yeah, we need to remove some things, because really it doesn't represent everybody, but we don't need to forget about it. So if we're I love how, Edgar, you said re-encode places, but I think we're also re-encoding faces, as well as the stories we tell on these landscapes. You know, we need, you know what, wherever you go, there you are. We can hide it, we can erase it, we can put it away, but it doesn't make it any less true. And that's for me why it shows up in all these ways. You know, Christian Cooper and George Floyd and all these things that have the consequences of that are always here. We're paying for it. We pay for it every single day, and some of us pay for it a lot more than others. So for me, it's like, how do we hold all those stories, the tension within those stories? And tension is only energy. We often make tension a bad thing, but you know, things need tension in order to grow. So how do we hold that tension and learn from that?
I do want to point out to your point that they have put a commemorative plaque there in Detroit where the riots began. So that does exist now, and it is a destination on Google Maps. But those consequences that you're describing right now, the thing which is so great about the moment that we're in is that you know that the broader white community and people of other ethnicities here in the U.S. that is part of that conversation now. I think that's what Black Lives Matters has done so well, is to give us a common vernacular to be able to have this conversation. Yeah. Because all of us are tired of having to prove to people that the shit that we're saying is true.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, I just tired of like having to prove it. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, thank God for, you know, big data. Because all you got to do is look at the numbers now. I don't have to tell you shit. Like, just go look it up on the internet, like the numbers are there. You know what I mean? Like, I don't, you know.
Exactly. I'm saying that all the time. Just so you don't want to listen to me, look over here. Over here, because it's everywhere.
There's some more questions for Carolyn. I don't know if you can see those or not.
Yeah, I can see them. I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure what this first one means, but Carolyn, I'm going to read it for you. It says, would Carolyn say a little more about us having been bamboozled by the environmental movement? I hope I have that right.
Yeah, because the first, I used, for most of the title chapters of my book, I specifically used titles from Spike Lee movies. Yeah. And so for the very first one, I chose Bamboozled. Now, when Spike Lee made the film, it's you know, he's talking about African-American stereotypes in television, in the media. I was talking about, or I am talking about, you know, we've been bamboozled in terms of the environmental narrative, or even narratives that we've told ourselves historically, the ones that we all learn about in school. And what I mean by that is something that I think all of us have been saying in different ways this last hour, which is we tell that one narrative, the one narrative of conquer, of manifest destiny, of who do we see on these landscapes who's really engaged with nature and the environment and the land. That narrative is not untrue, but we tell it as the complete narrative. One of the ways I always like to make that point is, and I only learned this when I was, you know, really, I had to teach a class around this, was look at the railroad. You know, when men built the railroad, 3,000 Chinese men helped to build that railroad. When you look at the final image, which is the famous picture of the golden spike, you do not see one Chinese person in that photograph. So those men that are in there, that you do see, they also helped build the railroad, right? That narrative is not untrue. Well, but we've been bamboozled to think that nobody else participated because it gets way complicated. And that was no accident. You don't leave out representation for 3,000 people unless you mean to leave them out. Mm-hmm. That's how we've been bamboozled, and we all lose. But some of us lose more than others in terms of our, you know, Black people don't fill in the blanks. There's so many things that we don't do, right, Corey? Right? There's so many things. We're like everybody.
Right. I think it really is also, you know, what I am not hearing, but I think we all understand, is that these questions are all about power, right? Of course, who's in power, who gets to put up the statue, who gets to take it down, who wants to do this, who is allowed the privilege of playing outside or in the environment, and all of those things. So, you know, I'm not sure. I liked hearing that hopefully these things will never happen again, but I hope that with the way the world is going, those questions of sort of an unchecked notion of power and using power as for terror in the placement and the revisionist history of these statues will not be able to happen again, just because of the way in which the world has evolved since that time. But I mean, I think it just requires everyone to be vigilant of that. And I also think, I really like where Edgar was talking about the notion of reclaiming or sort of going back out and doing those spaces. And I would encourage anyone to do that with permission or not, to put up your own monument. I challenge I would challenge my students, I challenge anyone listening, like, a monument does not necessarily have to be monumental. And it can be anywhere and for anybody in some regards. So, just because certain people seem to think that there is only one way or one narrative and one thing that we want to celebrate does not stop anyone from going out there and making their own. Right, reclaiming that power and that understanding of those things.
And I love that. I love that. I wrote that down, Corey. I'm going to quote you on that. A monument doesn't have to be monumental. And when we were talking about power, and I can think of two instances, but one is pretty famous, down on Wall Street in New York City, there's the discovery back in the 1990s when they were putting the building that's there now, it's now a national park site, the African Memorial, the African Burial Site. But at the time it was a building that was getting built for like the IRS and a bunch of other government agencies. And a black man, a journalist, was walking by when he saw the construction workers were pulling out, hefty garbage bags that they discovered were full of remains. And it was only then that he said, wait a minute, what is this that you all just throwing away? And then there was protests and everything about, wait a minute, we got to tell a story about who this is. That sometimes, and so now you've got an entire site, and poetry. And yes, that monument in some ways is monumental. And they were allowed to do it, but not without a fight, right? They had to have a fight in order to make the case. The other thing that I want to say is much smaller. Corey, you made me think about how my parents are from a small town in Virginia, Floyd, Virginia. And a few years ago, we drove down there, and I didn't know that all my father's family is buried on land that now belongs to a white farmer. And what the white farmer did, it's like in the center of his land, and he put a sort of old fence around it, and it's very overgrown, but he can't remove those. But when we stopped our car and we saw the farmer on a tractor, and he was very nice, but we had to ask permission. So we still are doing this within a set of rules and legislations and regulations about the question of ownership. So yes, a monument does not have to be monumental, but we also have to get creative about.
But he didn't make a path to this place so that people could just
pictures.
Over fences and things to get this. So it's there. It is set aside, but it is not made for visitors.
No, he didn't. You can't go inside because of snakes. It's so overgrown. It hasn't been cared for. He just, he didn't remove the bodies, right? So it's there. But I also have to say there was something about my father that broke my heart, having to ask permission to go visit his family on that site. The farmer was a nice man, so I'm not putting it on him. I'm just saying this issue of ownership, even with monuments, that's part of the issue here, that people can use the law to actually push back. And there can be a price to be paid for that.
Looks like we have another question.
Yeah, well, we have a question. Someone before you answered asked, Zaina asked about the statues and monuments. To kind of summarize, I think her question has mostly been answered, but the specific question at the end is, can a statue or object be reduced into a meaning of zero? The most erasure is done with people and stories. I don't know if there's anything more anyone wants to add to that point, or if we think we've covered that. I can read the.
Was it the final? You're talking about the final question?
No, I'm going to get to that now.
Okay.
So I think we did kind of answer some of that. But the next one is this person introduces themselves, Constance, and she curated the Feminine Sublime at the Pasadena Museum last year, and also it's a little bit lengthy, so bear with me, and Urban Nature at Art Center in 2016. Thank you so much for your inspiring artwork and words today. The Feminine Sublime looked at Kantian definitions of the sublime as based strictly on the white male gaze, and postulated a newer definition based on lone female immersion. My question for the panel is, should we stop using these Kantian definitions and attempt to construct newer ways we talk about a sublime experience? Uh-oh, what happened to it? I was reading it and it went away. Hold on.
Yeah, it did
I went
disappear.
to the answered.
Oh, go to answered. Yeah.
I got it. Sorry, I'm going to go back. My question for the panel is, should we stop using these Kantian definitions and attempt to construct newer ways we talk about a sublime experience without relying on Kant's problematic definitions? I think Corey's photo of himself standing in the snow certainly plays into traditional Kantian ideas, nature can kill you, but with this newer perspective.
Well, oh, Carolyn, you're gonna.
No, yeah, I have to think on that one.
Well, I guess to go back to what I was saying earlier, this idea that within the language, which is we have nature, which is this other thing, which is different than culture. We have this thing called landscape, which is a view, and then within those ideas of the sublime, you have the thing that is terrifying, that subsumes you, and that's what the sublime is. I think those are embedded in those ideas, I think, is all the separation, the cutting up of things, of experience and nature. So that I think we do probably need a new language. It's sort of like maybe environmentalism as a term is not useful anymore, because it speaks of this kind of this very kind of objective thing called the environment, which is out there and I'm here, as opposed to a much, like if you think of the living world as a term, versus nature, if you begin to think of those things as being embodied within us, as opposed to states that we view outside of ourselves. And I think a lot of the definition that comes from the sublime, which it has its uses, and again, it's produced some, beautiful, powerful work, but I do think it actually embedded and cooked into it is this our ideas of philosophies that are about separation of, and in that separation you could talk about it in general about nature versus culture, but then within, like, it's also feeds racist ideas, it feeds power structures as well. So I do think we probably need to come up with other language to describe those experiences.
I don't think we have to, I would offer the idea that it's not necessarily one language to replace another.
Right.
I like to think of things evolving. I like to think that if we are welcoming different subjectivities, different experiences, then we're just like we have different languages in the world that we speak. Mm-hmm. Why can't we have different ways of speaking about that? And for me, it's not to value. I think part of our challenge is that we often make one the primary. We primitize one and we devalue something else, or we diminish it. And instead, what does it mean to have all of those different ways of showing up and engaging? What do we gain by that? That's what's exciting. What can emerge if we allow that to happen? Yeah. And instead of codifying, there's a way that I feel like we have to codify everything, and it becomes the thing and the way to talk about it. And maybe that's what we have to change, our practice, the way we have. What is our relationship to the environment? And if we focus on relationships are fluid and they need to breathe in order to grow. So I like to think of it that way.
That's a great way of putting it.
That might be a nice note to end on. Yeah. If anyone has anything, if anyone doesn't have anything else that they feel like they really want to add, but so much to think through still, I think, for me in this conversation. And I feel like books can be written about all of these topics probably, but thank you all so much for your time and your incredible insight today. It was wonderful getting to hear your
thanks for bringing us all together.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed meeting everyone and seeing your work, which is amazing. Yeah.
We do hope the museum and the show will be open soon to the public. We're not sure when that is, but check ACMA's social media for more information on that. So, thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.